Chapter 1. The village of Marleycombe dozed in the late afternoon sun. It was an image of such profound and tranquil peace that it seemed almost impertinent to imagine it could be otherwise. Bees buzzed in chorus in the cascade of wisteria that adorned the cottage walls, and the air itself was warm and heavy with the scent of damp earth and freshly cut grass. To any passer-by, it was the very embodiment of rustic English tranquillity. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her favourite armchair by the window of her cosy sitting-room, enjoyed the view. But she wasn't fooled. Experience had taught her that a quiet village wasn't necessarily peaceful. It was simply a stage on which human dramas played out with a particular, often cruel, intensity. She was engaged in her daily struggle with a particularly tenacious embroidery, her needle piercing the linen with a precision that betrayed her aging hands. Her reverie was interrupted by a light, quick knock at her front door. A moment later, her faithful maid, Lucy, ushered in Miss Caroline Bentham, who entered the room without stepping forward. Miss Bentham was a woman whose life was devoted to the defence of noble causes and the dissemination of information, two activities she pursued with disconcerting vigour. "Jane, my dear, I hope I'm not disturbing you," she began without pausing for breath, settling into the chintz armchair opposite. "But I absolutely had to come and talk to you about the final preparations for the summer festival. You'll be at the jam stand as usual." "Excellent. And of course, we must discuss the pastor's unfortunate sermon last Sunday. Much too long, and all about those sad Corinthians. But that's not the real news, not by a long shot." Miss Marple put down her embroidery hoop and gave her a gentle smile. "I would have thought not, Caroline. Would you like some tea? Lucy has just brought in a new teapot." Miss Bentham brushed the offer aside with an impatient gesture. "No, thank you, my dear. One must watch one's figure, especially with the feast approaching. No, the news concerns the new arrivals at the old priory. They have finally moved in." "The Hartleys," Miss Marple said softly. The sale of the large, somewhat dilapidated house on the edge of the village had been the only topic of conversation for weeks. "Exactly. Arthur Hartley and his wife Elodie. He's someone from the city, I believe. Rich, of course. You have to be to go after that old geezer. And she," Miss Bentham lowered her voice conspiratorially, though no one else could hear. "Well, she's something else entirely. Half French, apparently. An artist, very modern, very beautiful in a rather theatrical way. Not at all the type you usually see in Marleycombe." Miss Marple made a small evasive noise. She had long observed that in villages, not as one usually sees things, could cover a multitude of sins, from wearing trousers in the main street to a secret penchant for murder. "I understand they have undertaken major renovations?" asked Miss Marple. "Oh, monstrous! The noise! They're digging up the old garden, building new walls. And the parties! Well, that's what I heard. We're not invited, of course." Miss Bentham's tone made it clear that this was a serious social affront. "But that's not the worst of it. The arguments. Their voices carry all the way to the end of the road, apparently. It's quite shocking. Mrs. Trellis, who cleans, says the atmosphere is simply icy one moment and volcanic the next. Everywhere in that garden gate, guess what?" Miss Marple's eyebrows raised a millimetre. "A garden gate? Yes, the old gate that leads from their property to the path into the woods. It's been there for a century, all rotten and covered in moss. She wants to tear it down and build something new and elegant. Apparently he's adamant that it must stay. He says it has character." Mrs. Trellis says she heard Mr. Hartley shout, "That gate stays, Elodie. It's not up for discussion." And then something broke. A vase, she thinks. It seems very strange to make such a fuss. "Indeed," murmured Miss Marple, her mind, like her knitting, beginning to gather threads and examine them. An argument about a portal was unusual. In her experience, such vehement disagreements rarely concerned the object itself, but what it represented. A boundary? A memory? A secret? Later that evening, after Miss Bentham had left, laden with a jar of gooseberry jam and a renewed sense of her own importance, Miss Marple went for a short walk. Her seemingly aimless path inevitably led her to the woods bordering the old priory. The evening was still light, the sky a soft shade of pink and orange. As she approached, she caught sight of the outline of the famous door. It was exactly as described, an old weathered oak, sagging on its hinges, almost swallowed up by a vigorous climbing rosebush. It was a picturesque forgotten place, and in front of it, with her back to Miss Marple, stood a woman. Even from behind, she was striking. She wore an emerald green tailored dress, and her dark hair was styled in an elegant chignon. She stood perfectly still, one hand resting on the top bar of the gate, as if testing its strength. Then she made a strange reaction. She leaned forward, not in an aggressive posture, but in one of intense, almost intimate concentration. She seemed to be listening. Miss Marple, partially hidden by the thick trunk of a centuries-old oak, held her breath. The woman, undoubtedly the beautiful and theatrical Elodie Hartley, remained there for a full minute, like a statue in the gloom. Then she straightened up, gently, almost reluctantly, pushed open the old gate, and turned to return to the house. She had only taken a few steps when a male figure emerged from the terrace. Arthur Hartley. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a determined stride. "Elodie!" Her voice, though not a shout, resonated clearly in the still air. It was tense with suppressed anger. "I told you to let it go." Elodie Hartley stopped and faced him, striking a provocative pose. "I was just watching, Arthur. We're allowed to watch." Her voice was low and had a slight melodic accent. "Looking leads to ideas, and your ideas about this door are not welcome. It must not be touched. Do you understand? I understand that you are being totally unreasonable about a piece of rotten wood," she retorted, her composure breaking. "That's none of your business," he retorted loudly. "This is my house, my land, my door. You will respect my wishes." The cruelty of those words hung in the air between them. Elodie Hartley straightened, and even from a distance, Miss Marple perceived the flash of pain and fury in her expression. Without another word, she turned and hurried into the house. Arthur Hartley watched her go, his fists clenched. Then he stared at the old gate, as if it were a personal enemy, before striding inside. Silence fell once more over the garden. The first bats began to flutter among the trees. Miss Marple stood motionless for a moment, her kind blue eyes lost in thought. She hadn't simply witnessed a marital quarrel. She had sensed something darker. A deep, lingering resentment centered on that mossy, dilapidated gate. What whisper lay hidden behind it? What secret could possibly provoke such venom? She shook her head slowly, a faint shudder of foreboding running through her. This was not at all, as her dear friend Caroline would say, the sort of thing one was used to. And in Miss Marple's experience, things one wasn't used to had a tendency to go very wrong. Chapter 2. The next morning, Marley Combe presented a perfectly normal face. The sun, a little brighter, dried the cobblestones of the main street after the previous night's dew. Housewives, baskets in hand, greeted each other in front of the butcher's shop, and the distant jingle of a bicycle bell was the loudest sound to disturb the tranquillity. The troubles of the old priory seemed light years away, a private drama confined behind the garden walls. Miss Marple, however, felt her thoughts return to the scene with the persistence of a stubborn tooth. Over breakfast, consisting of boiled eggs and thinly sliced toast, she turned the matter over in her mind. It wasn't the extent of the argument that troubled her. Even the best of marriages could produce a heated exchange. But its particular object, a door. It was such a trivial and tangible thing to become the focal point of such deep animosity. In her long life, Miss Marple had learned that when one fights so passionately over a trifle, one is almost always arguing about something else entirely. His thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of the mail. Among the circulars, and a letter from a nephew in Kenya, was a cream-coloured envelope, addressed in fluid and elegant handwriting. It was an invitation. Madame Arthur Hartley requests the pleasure of your company at a garden party to celebrate the opening of the restored old priory this Saturday at 3:00 in the afternoon. Miss Marple laid the map on the tablecloth, looking thoughtful. It seemed the Hartleys were making an effort to integrate into village life after all. Or perhaps, she mused, it was the effort of one partner, hastily arranged to smooth over difficulties caused by the other. The invitation was the only topic of conversation in the vicarage that afternoon, where Miss Marple had gone to deliver a batch of calf's foot jelly to a parishioner in need. The vicar, a kindly and absent-minded man named Reverend Clement, was pleasantly indifferent to the social currents around him, but his wife Beryl was not. "Of course we'll go, Reverend," said Mrs. Clement, pouring tea into fine china cups. "It's our duty as Christians to welcome newcomers, especially those who have undertaken such a significant restoration of a historic property. One might, however, question the timing. A garden party a few days early. It suggests a certain impulsiveness, don't you think, Miss Marple?" "Perhaps it suggests a desire for redemption," replied Miss Marple, accepting her cup. "Or a diversion." Mrs. Clement's eyes lit up. "A diversion? From what?" "Oh, I couldn't say," replied Miss Marple. "That's just an old woman's fantasy. They say the garden has been completely transformed. I understand there's been a lot of work done on the borders." This managed to steer the conversation back to safer topics, such as delphiniums and lupins. But Miss Marple had detected the keen interest in her friend's eyes. The invitation had been widely circulated, and by lunchtime the village was buzzing with new energy. The rumours about the Hartleys' quarrels were now being carefully highlighted, as was the exciting prospect of seeing inside the old priory. On Saturday, the dawn was clear and warm, perfect weather for a garden party. At 2:45, Miss Marple, dressed in her finest lilac chiffon gown and wearing a straw hat, walked up the long, freshly gravelled drive of the old priory. The house itself, an elegant Georgian structure of red bricks weathered by time, was splendid. The windows gleamed. The ivy had been tamed into picturesque submission, and the air smelled of silver and fresh paint. The guests gathered on the immaculate lawn were the very image of village society. Colonel Jameson, his face flushed and jovial, held court near the drinks table. Miss Bentham, wearing an imposing hat adorned with silk roses, was already deep in conversation with the hostess, her gaze scanning the crowd like a hawk's. The local general practitioner, Dr. Haydock, was talking with the vicar. Their hosts mingled among them. Arthur Hartley was an accomplished businessman in every respect. His suit was expensive, his handshake firm, his smile confident. But Miss Marple, observing closely, saw the effort behind it all. His smile didn't quite reach his eyes, which held a watchful, almost suspicious expression. And then there was Elodie. She was a vision, dressed in a simple white linen dress, a pearl necklace around her neck. She moved with understated elegance, a word here, a smile there, directing the staff with a discreet gesture. She was the perfect hostess. Yet, to Miss Marple's sharp eyes, she resembled a magnificent, tightly wound, mechanical doll. Her laughter was a little too brisk. her attention a little too fragile. Her gaze, like her husband's, kept drifting away from the guests, not towards the house, but towards the far end of the garden, towards the old gate. "A charming couple, aren't they?" murmured a voice beside Miss Marple. It was Dr. Haydock, who had separated from the vicar. "He's made a considerable effort to renovate the place. It was practically a ruin." "It's very beautiful," Miss Marple agreed, "and Mrs. Hartley seems to have adapted very well to country life." Dr. Haydock gave an evasive grunt. "Really, I'm not so sure. Her nerves are a bit frayed, in my opinion. I prescribed sedatives the other day. She's been having trouble sleeping, she said. Too much quiet after London, I suppose." He took a sip of lemonade. "Or perhaps not enough, if the rumours are true." Before Miss Marple could elaborate, their host approached. "Miss Marple, isn't that right? I'm delighted you were able to come," said Arthur Hartley in a well-rehearsed baritone voice. "I hope you're having a good time. Thank you very much, Mr. Hartley. Your house is lovely. The gardens are magnificent. That's kind of you. It's a labour of love. There's still work to be done, of course. Some things resist improvement." His gaze drifted, almost involuntarily, towards the back of the garden. His smile froze. "Oh, I don't know," said Miss Marple softly. "Sometimes old things are the best. They have character. That gate, for example, deep in the woods. It's so picturesque, covered with that rose. It seems to have a story to tell." The effect on Arthur Hartley was electric. His affable mask completely fell away, revealing a flash of hardness and coldness. His jaw tightened. "This gate is rotten, dangerous. It should have been demolished years ago. It serves no purpose." His tone was abrupt, final. Then, as if realizing his mistake, he forced a smile back, though it looked more like a grimace. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to attend to the Colonel. He looks thirsty." He turned and walked away, leaving behind a slight awkward silence. Dr. Haydock raised his eyebrows. "Well, a sensitive subject, apparently." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly, following their host's retreat with her eyes. "Absolutely." She glanced across the lawn and saw Elodie Hartley watching the exchange. Their eyes met for a brief moment. In the young woman's gaze, Miss Marple saw not anger, but a deep, chilling fear. Then Elodie turned away sharply, her hand trembling slightly, as she snatched a glass of champagne from a passing tray. The party continued, chatter and laughter rising in the afternoon air. Ice cubes clinked in glasses, cakes were eaten, and roses were complimented. It was all terribly civilized. But for Miss Marple the sun seemed to have lost some of its warmth. She had come to a garden party and found herself on the edge of a precipice, and the slightest jolt, she was certain, would bring this whole charming edifice crashing down. Chapter 3. The garden party ended with the same impeccable politeness with which it had begun. The guests departed from the old priory, their murmurs of thanks and admiration floating on the warm air like fireflies. They carried with them the image of a perfect afternoon, a story to unravel and embellish around the garden tables and fences. Miss Marple, returning slowly to her cottage, carried with her different, more unsettling impressions. The next day was Sunday, and the village of Marlicombe carried out its weekly ritual with solemn precision. St. Peter's bells rang across the fields, calling the faithful to morning service. The parishioners settled into their familiar pews, the rustle of Sunday best, and the scent of beeswax and hymn books creating a familiar and comforting atmosphere. Miss Marple, seated in her usual place in the middle of the aisle, watched the guests with discreet interest. The presence of the Hartleys caused a slight stir of attention. They sat on a bench in the front row, a handsome and respectable couple. Arthur Hartley bowed his head, evidently devout. Elodie beside him was perfectly still, her gaze fixed on the stained glass window above the altar. She wore a simple navy dress and a hat with a veil that hid her eyes. To most she appeared poised. To Miss Marple she seemed utterly distant, a figure reflected in a mirror. Reverend Clement's sermon was, as Miss Bentham had predicted, rather long, focusing on the virtues of charity and love of neighbour. While his voice hummed peacefully, Miss Marple's attention, though seemingly fixed on her hymn book, was elsewhere. She was observing the dynamics of her little world. She noticed Miss Bentham, 2 rows back, casting unsubtle glances at the Hartleys, taking notes for later dissemination. She saw Colonel Jameson nodding gently, succumbing to post-lunch drowsiness, and she saw Dr. Haydock sitting alone at the end of a bench, his professional gaze fixed on Elodie Hartley with an expression of clinical concern. After the ceremony, the congregation dispersed into the cemetery, blinking in the bright sunlight. The atmosphere was convivial, a continuation of the previous day's celebration. Small groups gathered around the Hartleys, exchanging jokes about the ceremony and renewing their thanks for their hospitality. Miss Marple found herself beside Dr. Haydock, near a large tombstone weathered by the elements. "She's pale," the doctor murmured, following Miss Marple's gaze toward Elodie Hartley, who accepted the compliment with a slight smile. "I advise rest, but one can only advise. Some patients are their own worst enemies." "It is difficult to rest when one is troubled," Miss Marple observed gently. "Troubled? What gives you that idea?" Haydock asked, though his tone suggested he shared it. "Oh, nothing specific," she replied. "Just a feeling. The air in the old priory seems heavy, doesn't it? Like before a storm." Before the doctor could reply, their conversation was interrupted by a newcomer, a man in his 30s, with an open and pleasant face and an easy smile, approached Elodie Hartley. He wasn't from the village. He wore well-cut but practical tweeds, and he looked as comfortable as someone who belonged in the countryside. "Well, Philip," said Arthur Hartley in a warm, forcedly friendly voice, "I didn't know you'd come back from London." "I got back last night, Arthur," the man replied, shaking Hartley's hand before turning to Elodie. His attitude toward her was noticeably warmer, more familiar. "Elodie, the garden was beautiful yesterday. Sorry I missed it." "Thank you, Philip," she said. And for the first time, Miss Marple saw a genuine, spontaneous smile touch her lips. It transformed her face, lifting the veil of sadness and fear. "We've missed you." "That's Philip Blake," Dr. Haydock informed Miss Marple in a low voice. "An old friend of the Hartley family, I believe. He's taken out a lease on the gamekeeper's house at the other end of the woods. A writer, or something like that. He seems like a nice fellow." Miss Marple watched the trio. Arthur Hartley's smile had remained fixed throughout the exchange, but a certain stiffness had settled into his posture. Philip Blake was clearly a friend, but his presence introduced a new variable into the already unstable equation of the Hartleys' marriage. The following Tuesday, the village was treated to another spectacle. Miss Marple, pruning her roses, heard the familiar screeching sound of machinery. Looking over her hedge, she saw a large mud-splattered lorry bearing the inscription, "Henderson's Landscaping and Earthworks," trudging down the road towards the old priory. Later that morning, from the same direction, came the unmistakable sound of a petrol engine and the cracking of splitting wood. Lucy, returning from the village grocery store, was fascinated by the news. "It's true, Miss Marple. They're going to take everything down, after all." Mrs. Trellis saw it herself. 2 men with a tractor and a chain. Mr. Hartley was there, guiding them, looking very sharp, but Mrs. Hartley was looking out the window upstairs, and she was smiling. So Arthur had surrendered. Really? Miss Marple felt a pang of regret. A man who had so vehemently opposed the removal of the door, who had called it my door with such possessive ferocity, didn't seem the type to capitulate so easily. It sounded less like an offer of peace than a declaration of war. Her unease proved justified. The next day, Wednesday, the village was shaken by news of a different kind. Lucy, pale-faced and with wide eyes, brought it with the morning tea. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's terrible," she breathed, slamming the tray down. "It's Mr. Hartley. He's dead." Miss Marple's hand froze on the teapot. "Dead? Good heavens, Lucy, what happened?" "They found him this morning. In the garden. Right where that old gate used to be." Lucy's voice turned into a horrified whisper. "Dr. Haydock is here, and they've called the Much Benham police. They're saying he's been murdered." The morning silence was suddenly absolute, broken only by the buzzing of a bee against the window pane. The premonition that had haunted Miss Marple during the garden party transformed into a cold, hard certainty. The tremor had finally occurred. The crack had been opened. "Murdered?" repeated Miss Marple calmly, even though her heart was beating a little faster. "What, Lucy?" The girl shuddered. They say his head was completely smashed, along with an old stone urn from the garden. It lay right next to him, on the ground, all covered in... Lucy couldn't finish, but she didn't need to. The image was terrifyingly clear. The peaceful English village, the argument about the gate, the beautiful couple and their secret tensions. It had all culminated in this brutal act. Miss Marple sat motionless, her mind already racing, rearranging the pieces of the puzzle she had assembled. The argument, the fear in Elodie's eyes, the sudden surprising collapse of the gate, the arrival of her friend, Philip Blake. She looked out the window at the serene, sunlit garden of her cottage. The murmur behind the gate had died away, replaced by a single deafening scream of violence. And Miss Marple understood with weary sadness that the real work was only just beginning. Chapter 4. The arrival of the Much Benham police was an event in itself. A black Wolseley sedan, stiff and out of place, purred through the village and headed straight for the old priory. In its wake, a wave of speculation spread through Marleycombe faster than any telegraph. The news was too shocking, too deliciously sinister, to be contained. Murder. Our village. In the mid-afternoon, a small, solemn crowd had discreetly gathered at the end of the driveway leading to Hartley Drive, held back by a young, uneasy-looking police officer who had been assigned there. They spoke in hushed tones, excited, their eyes wide with a mixture of horror and fascination. Miss Marple did not join them. Instead, she tended her garden, her attention fixed on the comings and goings on the path. She saw Dr. Haydock's car slowly drive away. She saw the police sedan remain, and later she caught sight of a familiar, plump figure dressed in a brown suit that was a little too tight, walking purposefully towards her cottage. Chief Inspector Arthur Drews of Much Benham Police knew Miss Marple well. Their paths had crossed on a previous unfortunate occasion in the neighbouring village of Chipping Cleghorn. He was an impassive and methodical man who believed in facts, fingerprints, and obvious motives. He had a deep respect for the law and a profound, though somewhat perplexed, respect for Miss Marple, whose methods he didn't understand, but whose results he couldn't deny. "Miss Marple," he said, wiping his brow with a handkerchief as he reached her door. "A bad deal. A very bad deal." "Good morning, Chief Inspector," she said, putting down her trowel. "I heard it was truly dreadful. Would you like to come in and have a cup of tea? I've just put the kettle on." Inspector Drews gratefully accepted. A few minutes later, sitting in his tidy living room, a cup of tea precariously balanced on his lap, he got straight to the point. "I understand you were at a party at the Hartleys on Saturday." "Yes," confirmed Miss Marple. "It was a very pleasant afternoon too. The gardens are magnificent. Have you noticed anything unusual? Any tension between Mr. and Mrs. Hartley?" Miss Marple sipped her tea. "Well, Inspector, it's not uncommon for a married couple to show some tension, especially when they're hosting a big party. But since you ask, yes, I did observe a certain tension." She recounted precisely and calmly her conversation with Arthur Hartley and his sharp reaction to his mention of the garden gate. She didn't embellish the facts. She simply reported the facts, the tone of voice, the change in attitude. She also mentioned Dr. Haydock's comment regarding the prescription of sedatives for Mrs. Hartley. Inspector Drews listened, notebook in hand, noting points. "The barrier," he murmured. "Yes, it's curious. It was taken down on Tuesday, as you surely know. Well, yesterday. And this morning he was found dead, right where it had been." He looked up at her. "His wife says they had an argument about it. A violent one, apparently, as recently as last night. She says he'd been drinking, that he was furious the barrier had been taken down against his wishes." "And what does she say happened?" asked Miss Marple softly. "She said she went to bed early with a Haydock pill. She didn't hear anything. When she woke up this morning, she found he wasn't in the house. She looked out the window and saw him lying in the dew. She ran and found him." The inspector's face was grim. The weapon was one of a pair of stone urns that flanked the gate. A real devil. It looks as if it was lifted and brought down on his head with considerable force. It probably killed him instantly. "It's terrible," murmured Miss Marple. "The case seems clear enough, Miss Marple," said Drews with a sigh that was half satisfaction, half regret. "They had a public argument about the portal at their own party. They had another private argument about it last night. He'd been drinking. He was a stout man, sometimes intimidating. His wife nervous, jittery, sedated. Perhaps he threatened her. Perhaps she simply snapped. She sees the urn, picks it up in a blind rage. And that's it." He shrugged his heavy shoulders. "Motive, opportunity, means. It's all there." "That seems very simple," agreed Miss Marple in a neutral tone. "The only problem is," Drews frowned, stirring his tea unnecessarily, "she's sticking to her story. No hysteria, just calm and collected. She says she loved him, that they made up after the argument. But the cleaning lady, a local Betty Cooper, says she heard the argument last night. Voices were raised. He was shouting about the gate, saying she was defying him. Then a door slammed. After that, silence, and the door itself, the one that was removed," asked Miss Marple. "The workmen took it away. They probably burned it. It's nothing but a pile of rotten wood now." He finished his tea and stood up. "Well, I won't keep you any longer. I just wanted to see if you'd noticed anything that might corroborate the family situation. So you believe Mrs. Hartley is guilty?" asked Miss Marple, looking up at him. "Everything seems to indicate that this is the case," said Inspector Drews firmly. "It's almost always the spouse, Miss Marple. In these kinds of cases, it's almost always the spouse. We'll take him in for further questioning this afternoon. I'd be very surprised if we didn't make an arrest by tomorrow." He thanked her for the tea and took his leave, walking back down the garden path with the gait of a man who has a difficult but obvious task to accomplish. Miss Marple remained seated, her hands clasped in her lap. She gazed at her peaceful garden, but it was that of the old priory she saw. The freshly turned earth where the gateposts had stood, the heavy stone urn, the silhouette of a man lying broken in the dawn light. "It's almost always the spouse." The words echoed in the silent room. It was police logic based on statistics and obvious facts, and on the surface it fit perfectly. The beautiful young wife, the wealthy and domineering husband, the public arguments, the violent final fight. But Miss Marple's mind, accustomed to the infinite complexities of human nature, latched onto a tiny, incongruous detail. It was neither the violence, nor the motive, nor the occasion. It was something else entirely. She remembered the garden party, Arthur Hartley's face, his voice, when she had mentioned the gate. This gate is rotten, dangerous. It should have been demolished years ago. It serves no purpose. He had been vehement, angry, possessive. This is my door. You will respect my wishes. Then, 2 days later, he authorized workers to come and demolish it. He himself supervised its destruction. A man like Arthur Hartley, used to getting what he wanted, who had invested such powerful emotion in an object, did not give up, unless something had changed. Unless the reason for his possessiveness had suddenly vanished, the door had disappeared, and now Arthur Hartley was gone. Miss Marple felt a cold certainty wash over her. Inspector Drews was wrong. It wasn't simple at all. The removal of the grate wasn't the prelude to the murder. It was the key. Someone had desperately wanted that grate gone, and it wasn't Elodie Hartley. The chief inspector was looking for a crime of passion. But Miss Marple, attuned to the whispers of human nature, began to suspect something far more serious. A calculated crime. Chapter 5. The arrest of Elodie Hartley sent shockwaves through Marleycombe, a shock far more intense than the initial news of the murder. It was one thing for a violent death to disturb the tranquillity of the village. It was quite another to see one of its own, however recent, being taken away in the back of a black police car. Miss Marple watched the scene from her window. She saw Elodie, pale but serene, descend the steps of the old priory, flanked by Inspector Drews and a uniformed sergeant. She didn't look like a vengeful murderer. She resembled a sleepwalker, a woman trapped in a terrible dream from which she couldn't awaken. There was no hysterical outburst, no protest. Her head was held high, but her gaze was blank, seeing nothing. The village's reaction was immediate and conflicted. The consensus, fueled by the confident murmurs of those who claimed to know the story from the inside, quickly hardened against her. Miss Bentham, of course, was at the forefront of this faction. I knew it from the start, she announced in a hushed, confident voice outside the post office later that day. She had attacked Miss Marple, who had gone out to fetch a fresh ball of yarn. All the foreign drama, the arguments, the nervousness. It was only a matter of time. A crime of passion, pure and simple. Dr. Haydock said she was on edge. He prescribed sedatives for my sleep problems, Miss Marple gently corrected. That's not quite the same thing. This reveals a fragile temperament, insisted Miss Bentham, and one must consider the motive. A rich husband, a beautiful young wife. It's a classic tale. Perhaps she had a lover. Perhaps she wanted her freedom. That door was the last straw. This theory was met with nods of approval from the small group of women gathered around her. It was a satisfactory, clear, and easy-to-understand account. There was no need to think about it further, but not everyone was convinced. As Miss Marple continued her run, she overheard snippets of conversation. Mrs. Trellis, the Hartleys' housekeeper, was speaking to the butcher's wife in a low, troubled voice. But she wasn't like that. Not violent. She was afraid of him, rather. I saw her jump when he entered a room, and lifting that big stone. That's a bit ridiculous. It doesn't seem normal to me. In the village shop, old Mr. Cuthbert, who delivered the coal, was speaking to the owner. I saw that urn when it was being unloaded a few months ago. It weighed a ton. It took 2 strong men to move it. How could such a fragile creature lift it above its head and bring it down violently enough to kill a big ox like Hartley? It makes no sense. This was the other side of the village's soul. Its pragmatic and down-to-earth wisdom, which often ran counter to the flood of sensational gossip. It was a wisdom in which Miss Marple placed far more trust. Her next stop was the presbytery. She found Mrs. Clement in a state of extreme agitation, arranging and rearranging flowers in a vase with nervous energy. "Oh, Jane, that's awful!" she exclaimed. "To think of that poor young woman in her cell. Of course, if she did that, she must be punished, but, well, it all seems so sudden. Inspector Drews seems so sure of himself." "The police must rely on the evidence as they see it," Miss Marple said calmly, sitting down. "But it is always wise to keep an open mind and a compassionate heart." "The vicar is very upset. He went to see her, at the police station, to offer her spiritual comfort. He said she was very quiet. She kept repeating, 'I didn't do anything. I loved him.' It's very tragic." Miss Marple pricked up her ears. That was kind of the vicar. Did he mention anything else about his visit? About his state of mind? Well, Mrs. Clement lowered her voice. He said she seemed perplexed. She said that when she looked out the window and saw Arthur lying there, she was sure the grill was still there. She said she saw his shape in the mist, but of course it had been taken down several days before. The vicar thought it was just the shock playing tricks on him. Miss Marple was perfectly still. She could make out her silhouette in the mist. The words seemed to float in the air, laden with meaning. This was the first thing that deviated from Inspector Drews's precise picture. She left the rectory and embarked on a slow, pensive walk. Her path, as if guided by an invisible hand, led her not to her house, but to the woods bordering the old priory. The police had finished their work. The path was quiet again. The yellow tape removed. The feeling of having been transgressed had dissipated, leaving only a lingering sadness. She stood at the edge of the trees, gazing at the house. From there, she could see the terrace, the immaculate lawn, and the rough, disturbed earth at the back of the garden, where the gate had once stood. The corresponding stone urn was gone, taken as evidence. Its twin stood alone, a solemn sentinel of the horror that had occurred. Her gaze shifted from the empty space to the windows of the house. An upstairs window, probably the Hartleys' bedroom, offered a clear view of the place. Elodie Hartley, waking at dawn, looking outside. What had she seen? A shape in the mist? The ghost of a gate that was no longer there? The sudden snap of a twig behind her made her turn around. A man was emerging from the path through the woods. It was Philip Blake. He looked tired, his kind face etched with worry. He was holding a book, but he didn't appear to have been reading. "Miss Marple," he said, slightly surprised. "I didn't expect to see anyone here." "I was just getting some fresh air, Mr. Blake," she said. "It's so sad." He ran a hand through his hair. "It's a terrible tragedy, and a monstrous injustice. Elodie couldn't have done that. It's impossible. You seem very confident." "I am," he said fiercely. "I've known her for years. I know them both. Arthur could be difficult, stubborn, but she's not violent. She's gentle, and to suggest she could physically overpower him." He shook his head. "The police won't listen to anything. They have their theory, and they're sticking to it." "That's often the case," sighed Miss Marple. "They look for the simplest answer. But life is rarely simple, is it? Tell me, Mr. Blake, as a friend of the family, what was your impression of this whole business with the portal? It seems to have been a real point of contention." Philip Blake's face darkened. "It was absurd. Arthur was completely obsessed with it. It was just an old gate. but he refused to let anyone touch it. Elodie thought it was unsightly, even dangerous. She wanted something new, something cheerful. I thought he'd finally understood why when he had it taken down. He kicked a moss-covered stone. Now I wonder if that was the worst thing he could have done. "Why do you say that?" asked Miss Marple in a soft voice. He looked up and, for a moment, a different emotion crossed his gaze. Not just anger or sadness, but something colder, more calculating. It vanished in an instant, replaced by a weary concern. "I don't know. It seems like everything went wrong after that, and now, well, and now this." He gave her a polite nod and continued on his way to the village, leaving Miss Marple alone with her thoughts. Her gaze shifted from the empty space where the gate had stood to the path through the woods that led to Philip Blake's cottage. A family friend, a writer who kept to his own schedule, a man who had known Elodie for years. She saw its form in the mist. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place in Miss Marple's mind, forming a new, more disturbing picture. The police believed that removing the barrier had precipitated a crime of passion. But what if it were the other way around? What if removing the barrier had been the purpose of the crime? Someone had wanted to get rid of that door, not for aesthetic or security reasons, but for a much darker one. And now that it was gone, that person thought they were safe. But that was without taking Miss Marple into account. That was without taking into account a mind that understood that the most dangerous secrets are not hidden behind locked doors, but buried in plain sight, in the subtle details of human behavior that others ignore. The ghost of the door still whispered, and Miss Marple was the only one who listened. Chapter 6. The next day, Marley Combe settled into a new, darker rhythm. The initial shock had subsided, replaced by a wave of speculation. With Elodie Hartley in custody, the village felt both safer and strangely deflated, as if the protagonist of their collective drama had left the stage too soon. The police presence had dwindled to a single officer conducting periodic checks in the now silent old priory. It was this atmosphere of precarious calm that Miss Marple decided to penetrate. With her gentleness and methodical approach, she began her investigation not with questions, but with listening. Her first stop was the village grocery store, that essential crossroads of commerce and communication. Mrs. Palmer, the shopkeeper, was delighted to discuss the tragedy, the words tumbling out as she weighed out sugar for Miss Marple. Terrible, truly terrible, Miss Marple. And to think she seemed so nice, if a bit aloof. But then again, that's how it is with those sorts of people, isn't it? You never really know. It is indeed difficult to really know someone, Miss Marple agreed. I understand that some workmen were involved in demolishing the gate. Were they local? Oh yes, Henderson's gang from Much Benham. Reliable lads. Bert Henderson himself drove the tractor. Mrs. Palmer leaned forward. My nephew, young Tommy, sometimes helps them out to earn a bit of money. He was here on Tuesday, really. Miss Marple's interest was genuine. That must have been quite a job. Those old oak posts must have been driven in very deep. That's right. Tommy said it was a real fuss. Mr. Hartley was there the whole time, watching them closely. Tommy said he was in a bad mood, shouting at them to be careful not to damage the roses, as if they cared about his roses. They were just there to do their job. Was he particularly particular about roses? Asked Miss Marple. Apparently, especially the big white tree growing through the rotten wood. Tommy said Mr. Hartley had them trimmed with particular care, almost as if he wanted to save it. Strange, isn't it? Furious that the gate was collapsing, but tending to a flower. Mrs. Palmer shook her head. Anyway, They took the thing down, loaded the pieces into the truck and left. Mr. Hartley paid them cash on the spot and sent them home. Miss Marple paid for her sugar and left, her mind reeling. Arthur Hartley, overseeing the destruction of the object he cherished so much, meticulously managing the preservation of a rose. It was a contradiction that remained etched in his mind. His next stop was the cottage of Mrs. Trellis, the Hartleys' housekeeper. The woman opened the door, her eyes red, a handkerchief clutched in her hand. "Oh, Miss Marple, come in, come in. It's a dreadful case. I can't believe it. Not Mrs. Hartley. She wasn't happy, poor thing, but she wasn't a murderer." Miss Marple accepted a seat and a cup of light tea. "The police seem to think otherwise, I'm afraid." "The police!" snorted Mrs. Trellis mockingly. "They don't see what's happening. They only see the screaming. They don't see the fear." She leaned forward. "He was a cruel man, Miss Marple. Oh, not with his hands, as far as I know, but with his words. He could say things that wounded you to the core, and he liked to do things his own way. That portal, it was like a madhouse of his. Did he ever say why it was so important to him?" asked Miss Marple. "Not for me, he didn't hear me, but I heard him on the phone once, about a week ago. He was in his office and he didn't hear me crumble to dust. He was saying, 'That's none of your business. It's my property. What's buried on my land stays on my land.' He sounded furious." She shuddered. "Then he heard me and hung up abruptly. He gave me a real dressing down for eavesdropping, which I never did. And what's buried on my land stays on my land." The words floated in the stifling air of the small cottage. They seemed to absorb all the noise in the room. "Have you reported this to the police, Mrs. Trellis?" asked Miss Marple gently. The woman looked frightened. "I don't know. Oh, no, miss. I didn't want to be involved in this, any more than I am. And it probably didn't mean anything. Just that he was difficult as always." Miss Marple didn't press the matter. She finished her tea, offered her condolences, and took her leave. The rooms were beginning to form a new, darker picture. A door that was more than a door. A man obsessed with what lay buried near it. A rose carefully preserved from the rubble. Her last call of the afternoon was to Dr. Haydock. She found him in his office, surrounded by medical journals, looking exhausted. "Miss Marple," he said, rising to his feet, "have you come to present your diagnosis?" "No." There was a hint of ironic humour in his voice, born of experience. "I wouldn't presume to say anything, doctor," she said with a slight smile. "However, I wanted to ask you about your patient, Mrs. Hartley. You mentioned that she was disturbed. Could you elaborate?" Haydock gestured for him to sit down and sank back into his chair. "It's a breach of confidentiality, of course, but given the circumstances, she was suffering from intense anxiety, nightmares. She said she felt watched, unsafe in her own home. She was afraid of something, but she wouldn't say what. I attributed it to the stresses of an unhappy marriage and the isolation of moving." He sighed. "I prescribed phenobarbital, the standard treatment. She said it helped her sleep, but it didn't alleviate her underlying fear." "And the dosage?" asked Miss Marple. "Would it have rendered her unconscious, incapable of being awakened by, say, an argument or a slamming door?" The doctor looked at her sternly. "The prescribed dose? No, it would promote sleep, but a loud noise would certainly wake her. A determined person could fight the drowsiness." "Why do you ask?" "The police theory rests simply on the fact that she took a sedative and slept through the incident," said Miss Marple. "But if she was in a state of extreme anxiety, fearing something at home, couldn't she have stayed awake, listening? Would she have heard something completely different?" Dr. Haydock remained silent for a moment, thinking. "It's possible, very possible. Anxiety doesn't always respond to medication. It often sharpens the senses. He frowned. You believe her to be innocent. I think, Miss Marple said cautiously, that there are too many loose ends. A man doesn't fiercely guard a door only to have it suddenly destroyed. A woman doesn't carefully protect a rose from a structure she despises. And one rarely says things like, "What's buried on my land stays on my land," without reason. The doctor's eyes widened. Who said that? Mr. Hartley, apparently. On the telephone. Miss Marple rose to leave. Tell me, doctor, if someone buried something near an old gatepost, and years later someone wanted to dig it up unseen, how would they go about it? Haydock looked bewildered. Well, I suppose they'd need a reason to dig, to landscape the garden, to remove the fence itself. Exactly, said Miss Marple softly. They would need a reason they could convince the gate owner of, a reason like a wife's desire for a better view. She let the doctor stare at her, forgetting her medical records. The scenario was now clear in her mind. The argument had never been about the door itself. It was a smokescreen, a performance for a single audience. Arthur Hartley. Someone had wanted that door removed. Someone had campaigned for it, had stoked Elodie's dislike for it, had perhaps even promised her a beautiful new door once the old, hideous one was gone. And once the thing was gone and the earth disturbed, someone had gone digging at night to find what was buried there. Arthur Hartley, suspecting the true motive, had confronted them, and he had died for it. The killer wasn't the wife who wanted the gate gone. The killer was the person who needed it, and they were still free, convinced they had committed the perfect crime, hiding behind the convenient pretext of a marital dispute. But they had made a mistake. They had not taken into account the silent and observant old lady in the cottage at the end of the road, who understood that the smallest details, a preserved rose, a neglected phrase, a dosage of medicine, often contain the greatest truths. Chapter 7. A surge of energy seized Miss Marple. The well-formed theory taking shape in her mind was too nebulous, too reliant on whispers and deductions, to be presented to the pragmatic Inspector Drews. He needed proof, something tangible to shake his faith in the obvious. She needed to understand the physical scene at which the tragedy had unfolded. Later that afternoon, under the pretext of returning a borrowed gardening book, Miss Marple presented herself at the gamekeeper's cottage rented by Philip Blake. This cottage was a picturesque, low-beamed building nestled deep in the woods, a good 20-minute walk from the old priory. It evoked solitude and silent contemplation, the ideal refuge for a writer. Philip Blake opened the door himself. He seemed surprised to see her, her pleasant face darkened by the lingering shock of recent events. "Miss Marple, this is an unexpected pleasure. Please come in." He led her into a small book-lined sitting room, where a fire smouldered in the fireplace despite the heat of the day. Manuscript pages were scattered on a desk by the window. "May I offer you some tea?" "That's very kind, but no thank you," said Miss Marple, accepting the offered seat. She placed the gardening book on a side table. "I just returned it to Dr. Haydock and thought I'd take the scenic route home. It really is a lovely, secluded spot." "That's true," Blake agreed, sitting opposite her. "It allows me to work without interruption. Well, it used to." His smile was weary. "I've had trouble concentrating these past few days. I can well imagine. This must be particularly difficult for you, being a close friend of the family." He ran a hand through his hair. "And so, hey, and so. This is a nightmare. Arthur was a difficult man, but he didn't deserve this. And Elodie," he shook his head, his jaw clenched. "It's the police are making a terrible mistake. Are you completely convinced of his innocence? Absolutely. It's not in his nature. And as I said before, it's physically impossible. He gestured around the comfortable room. I'm trying to work, to take my mind off things, but I can't stop thinking about that night. The night of the murder? Asked Miss Marple in a soft voice. The night before, actually. The last time I saw them both. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I had dinner there. It was tense. Arthur was in a bad mood, still furious about the gate disappearing. He'd had a lot to drink. Elodie was quiet, nervous. I left early, around 9:30 p.m, to escape the atmosphere. I walked back here through the woods. He gestured toward the window overlooking a thicket. The path leads right next to that damned gate. Miss Marple followed his gesture with her eyes. Geography was important. The path that led from her cottage directly to the scene of the crime. It must have been a dark walk, she observed. Every day was dark. I had a flashlight, of course. I remember hearing something. An animal, I suppose, rustling in the undergrowth near the door. I shone my flashlight, but I didn't see anything. I didn't pay any attention to it at the time. He gave a hollow laugh. Now I'm wondering. It's easy to see the importance of everything in hindsight. Miss Marple agreed sympathetically. And you heard or saw nothing else on your return? No. I worked for a few hours, then went to bed. I sleep soundly. I didn't hear anything until the police arrived the next morning, asking me if I had seen or heard anything unusual. He looked at her, his expression serious. I wish I had. Maybe I could have prevented it. Miss Marple offered him a few words of comfort before taking her leave. The walk back through the woods was slow and purposeful. She followed the path described by Philip Blake, a well-trodden track, carpeted with pine needles and bathed in the late afternoon light. It did indeed emerge from the edge of the trees, directly opposite the patch of bare earth that marked the grave of the old gate. She stood there for a long time, her piercing gaze missing nothing. The police had done a meticulous job. The area had been trampled and searched, but they were looking for signs of a struggle, a woman attacking a man. Miss Marple was looking for something else entirely. She advanced slowly, her gaze scanning the ground, the surrounding bushes, the base of the only stone urn still standing. And then she saw it, not in the disturbed earth of the gatepost hole, but a few meters away, nestled in the roots of a rhododendron, where the lawn met the woods. A button. It was a small, flat button made of a dark, horn-like material. It was ordinary, the kind of button you'd find on a tweed jacket or waistcoat. It could have been there for weeks, fallen off a garment, but it was clean, not yet tarnished by rain or dirt, and it was in a spot just beyond the light source in the house, a place where someone might have been standing to watch or wait. She bent down sharply, picked it up with a handkerchief, and slipped it into her pocket. Her next discovery was even more curious. On the trunk of a beech tree that stood guard at the entrance to the path, about shoulder height, she discovered a series of light, recent scratches in the bark. These weren't the random marks of an animal. They were deliberate tracks, a series of short parallel grooves, like those made by the ferrule of a walking stick or the point of a knife tapping impatiently against the wood. A nervous habit. A signal, perhaps? Miss Marple's heart beat a little faster. She was on the right track. The killer was standing there. They were nervous, and they'd lost a button. She continued her examination, her gaze fixed on the ground at the foot of the tree. The soil was soft and damp, and there, pressed into the earth, was the clear, fresh imprint of a man's shoe. It was a distinctive sole, with a diamond pattern on the heel and a long, narrow sole. It was not the heavy boot of a labourer, nor the practical shoe of a country gentleman like Arthur Hartley. It was an urban shoe, a stylish shoe. It was also pointing towards the house, and not in the opposite direction. Someone had stood there in the darkness after the workmen had left. After Philip Blake had gone home, someone had waited watching the house, perhaps waiting for a light to go out. Then they had walked out onto the terrace, to the spot where Arthur Hartley had died. Miss Marple retraced her steps to the disturbed earth where the door had been. The police had dug here, looking for blood, for the murder weapon. But they hadn't dug deep enough. They hadn't looked for what was supposed to be there. She used her own walking stick to gently probe the loosened earth at the bottom of one of the post holes. The stick met resistance a few centimeters down, something that wasn't a stone. She knelt down, ignoring the protest of her knees, and carefully scraped the earth with her hands. Her fingers closed around something small, cold and metallic. She took it out and wiped the dirt with her handkerchief. It was a woman's powder compact, made of aged and tarnished silver. The hinge was broken and the inner mirror cracked. On the lid, a single initial, engraved in a flowing Art Deco script, was engraved LL. Who was L? It wasn't Elodie. It wasn't anyone Miss Marple had already met in this story. She stared at the small object resting in her palm. This was what someone had been looking for. This was the secret buried beneath the garden gate. This was the reason for the whispered arguments, the carefully orchestrated removal of the gate, and the terrible violence that had followed. Arthur Hartley had been killed not because of an argument with his wife, but because he had guarded a secret that someone else was desperately trying to uncover, and they had succeeded. They had what they came for, but they had left something behind. A button, a scratch on a tree, a shoe print, and a broken powder compact. They were small, inconspicuous objects easily overlooked, but to Miss Marple they were as loud as a scream in the silence of the woods. The killer had believed that removing the portal would erase the past. Instead, it had only begun to reveal it. Chapter 8. The powder compact felt heavy in Miss Marple's pocket, a cold metallic secret against her leg. The initial L seemed to pierce the fabric, a single enigmatic clue to a story she couldn't yet decipher. She needed context. She needed to understand the story of the old priory and the door that had become its focal point. Her steps inevitably led her to the only person in Marleycombe who was a living keeper of the village's history, old Mr. Sutcliffe. He was nearing 90, stooped and gnarled like an old apple tree, and had lived his entire life in a cottage overlooking the greenery. His mind, however, remained sharp, his memory a well-organized archive of births, deaths, scandals, and sales. She found him in his small, well-kept garden, methodically pruning the faded rose bushes with an expert hand. He looked up as she approached, his gaze milky but lively. "Miss Marple," he whispered, a smile revealing pink gums. "Come and talk about the murder, I'm sure. The village is full of them." "It's a sad story, Mr. Sutcliffe," she said, sitting down on a worn bench he indicated. "And so confusing. It seems like everything revolves around that old gate in the priory garden. I was wondering if you remembered its story." "The gate?" He chuckled, a dry rustle. "Yes, I remember it. It was there when I was little. There was always something strange about that gate." He sat down slowly on the bench beside her. The old priory then belonged to the Pharaohs, a good family, almost extinct. The last of them was Miss Lucinda. Lucinda. Miss Marple wore a simply interested expression. "Oh, yes, Miss Lucinda Farrow. What a beauty she was. A bit wild, though. A head full of romanticism. She got involved with a man her family didn't approve of. An artist, I think, or a poet. A penniless man with no future." He shook his head slowly. There was a terrible argument. Her father forbade her to see him. But that gate, that's how they met. He would walk through the woods. She would slip out through the gate. They would leave each other little notes tucked away in the mail. He pointed a gnarled finger towards the distant priory. Old Mr. Farrow discovered it. He was furious. He nailed the door shut himself, so they say. Then he sent Miss Lucinda to stay with relatives up north. He never saw her again. What happened to the young man? Asked Miss Marple softly. Gone. Gone. Heartbroken, they say. Or simply ruined. The Farrows sold the house soon after. It changed hands several times before your Mr. Hartley bought it. He sighed. That was almost 60 years ago. Poor Miss Lucinda. I heard she died young. Of tuberculosis, perhaps. A life wasted on love, in my opinion. A life ruined by love. And a powder compact, engraved with an L, buried near a garden gate. It was a small, tragic story. A fragment of a village's forgotten history. But what was its connection to the present? How could a 60-year-old love affair lead to murder? Miss Marple thanked old Mr. Sutcliffe and went home, her mind in turmoil. Arthur Hartley, a pragmatic businessman, wouldn't have given any importance to a dusty old love affair. Unless he had discovered the pact. Unless he had understood its significance, not as a historical curiosity, but as a threat. She thought back to the phone call Mrs. Trellis had overheard. What's buried on my land stays on my land. He wasn't talking about treasure. He was talking about evidence. Evidence of an old secret someone desperately wanted to keep buried. But who? The artist had been gone for a long time. That much was certain. Lucinda was dead. The secret should have died with them, unless that's not the case. A new, surprising, and chilling idea began to take root in her mind. She thought of Philip Blake, the family friend, the writer, a man who earned his living by asking questions, a man who had known the Hartleys for years, a man with an easy smile who rented a cottage whose driveway led directly to the scene of the crime. She remembered the button in his pocket, the elegant print of his city shoes. Philip Blake wore tweed jackets. He lived in London part of the time. He had shoes like that, and he was a writer. What did he write? She realized she had never asked. Biographies, stories, family histories. She quickened her pace, driven by a sense of urgency. She had to speak to Inspector Drews. She had to make him understand that the past was not dead, that it had spread like a stone urn and crashed into the present. She found the inspector at Much Benham Police Station, looking harassed and burdened with paperwork. He looked up when she was shown in, his expression a mixture of respect and mistrust. "Miss Marple, I'm rather busy, as you can see. I'm preparing the case for the prosecutor." "I won't take up too much of your time, Inspector," she said, sitting demurely in the chair opposite her desk. "I've conducted a few small investigations myself." Drews sighed. "Miss Marple, with all due respect, this is not a small-town matter. It's a simple case. We have a motive, an opportunity, and the means. Mrs. Hartley will be formally charged tomorrow." "I wonder if you'd be willing to do something nice for an old woman," she said in a soft but firm voice. She placed the horn button, wrapped in her handkerchief, on her desk. "I found this near the crime scene in the rhododendrons. It came from a man's jacket, I think. A tweed jacket." Drews picked it up, frowning. "It could have been there for weeks. It proves nothing. Maybe not." She then described the shoe's footprint, the characteristic narrow sole with the diamond-shaped heel. The inspector frowned. Hartley didn't wear shoes like that, but then again they could belong to anyone. A party guest. "And then there's this." She placed the tarnished silver powder compact on the desk. The initial L caught the light. Drews stared at him. "What is it?" "I believe that's what the killer was looking for after the gate was removed. I found it buried in a post-hole." She then recounted the story of Lucinda Farrow and her forbidden artist, as told by old Mr. Sutcliffe. Inspector Drews listened intently. "A sad story, Miss Marple, but it's ancient history. What does it have to do with anything? Don't you see?" she said, her voice taking on a rare intensity. "The murder wasn't related to a marital dispute. It was about this. Arthur Hartley discovered this pact. He knew it was proof of something. He was obsessed with the door, protecting it, because he knew that beneath it lay a secret that someone would kill to hide." "Who?" asked Drews, his scepticism palpable. "A ghost from 60 years ago?" "Not a ghost," said Miss Marple, leaning forward. "A descendant, someone for whom this secret is not ancient history, but a real threat to their reputation, their legacy, even their identity. Someone who knew the story and needed to retrieve this evidence before it was discovered. Someone who campaigned for the removal of the door, who knew of Elodie Hartley's loathing of it, and who used it as the perfect smokescreen to find what they needed." She looked at him seriously. The killer didn't argue with Arthur Hartley that night because of the portal. They argued because Hartley caught them digging. He confronted them, and he was killed for it. The stone urn was practical, but the motive was a buried treasure of a completely different kind. Inspector Drews remained silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the powder compact. He was a pragmatic man, but he had learned reluctantly to trust this elderly woman's strange instincts. "It's a fantastic theory," he said finally. "But who? Who would care about a 60-year-old scandal?" "Someone who stands to lose a great deal if this is revealed," replied Miss Marple. "Someone for whom the past is not the past. You must look beyond the obvious, Inspector. You must find out who knew the history of this house. You must find out who benefited from the removal of the gate. And you must find the owner of a pair of shoes with narrow soles and diamond heels." She stood up to leave, leaving the button and compact on her desk. "The answer isn't in the present, Inspector. It's in the past. And I fear that if you charge Elodie Hartley, the real killer will disappear back into the present, forever." She left him sitting there, surrounded by his modern evidence, staring at a silver coin older than himself, wondering if the quietest voice in the room was, once again, the one telling the truth. Chapter 9. Inspector Drews's patience, never particularly deep, was finally wearing thin. Miss Marple's theory about 60-year-old secrets and motives linked to lineage struck him as the fanciful ramblings of an overly busy and impractical old woman. The following morning he made it official. Elodie Hartley was charged with the murder of her husband, Arthur. The news was like a cannonball thrown into the Marleycombe pond, unleashing a fresh wave of emotion that drowned out all other conversation. Miss Marple received the news from a distraught Lucy with a faint sigh. She had hoped to avoid this. Now the wheels of justice would turn, and an innocent woman would be crushed in their gears if she couldn't provide Drews with something he couldn't ignore. Her mind returned to the pact. Earl for Lucinda. That was the key. But a key was useless without a lock. She needed to understand who, today, would be threatened by her discovery. The answer lay not in village gossip, but in a particular and painful story. She decided a different approach was needed. If the inspector refused to listen, perhaps she could encourage someone else to speak. Someone who was feeling nervous, triumphant, or guilty. Someone who might be about to make a mistake. Her target was Philip Blake. He had been friends with both Hartleys. He knew the story, and he was on the scene, his cottage being connected by a dark path to the murder site. She didn't believe he was the murderer. The shoe print and the button didn't resemble his. But he could be the trigger. He was a writer, a collector of stories. Perhaps he had unwittingly stirred up the past. She found him not at his cottage, but at the old priory itself. He was standing on the terrace, hands in his pockets, admiring the garden. He turned as she approached, and she was struck by the sombre expression on his usually kind face. "Miss Marple, have you come to see the crime scene?" Her tone was bitter. "I came to see you, Mr. Blake," she said calmly. "I wanted to ask you about your writing. I understand you are a writer." The question seemed to surprise him. Yes, I write biographies. Historical texts, mostly." "How fascinating," she said, her voice filled with delicate interest. "I've always thought that to understand a person, you have to understand their history, their family, the secrets that shaped them." She paused, observing him closely. "I spoke to old Mr. Sutcliffe yesterday. He told me the most tragic story in this house. The story of a young woman named Lucinda Farrow. She saw it. A gleam in her eyes. Not recognition, but a keen and alert interest. It was the look of a writer who has just heard a promising lead." "Lucinda Farrow?" he repeated. "No, I don't believe I came across that name during my research on the house." "Oh, that was long before your time, I'm sure," said Miss Marple lightly. "A brief love affair. She had a suitor whom her family disapproved of. They often met at the old garden gate. He was an artist, I believe. It all ended very sadly. She was dismissed and died young." She sighed. "One might wonder, wouldn't you say, what became of the artist? Did he ever love anyone else? Did he have children? Grandchildren even, who may never know the story of their grandfather's lost love?" Philip Blake stared at her, his writer's mind clearly exploring all possibilities. "It's a tragic story," he said slowly. "It would be a poignant chapter in social history. The human cost of class prejudice." He seemed to forget her for a moment, lost in thought. "An artist? I wonder what his name was." "I'm sure Mr. Sutcliffe wouldn't remember it," said Miss Marple. "It was so long ago. But the past has a funny way of whispering something to us, doesn't it? Especially in old houses. I imagine Arthur Hartley must have stumbled upon some trace of it. He's been acting so strangely about that gate. It was as if he'd found something buried there." This time, the reaction was different. Blake's face froze, the writer's curiosity replaced by a sudden and keen caution. "Arthur? What could he have found?" "Oh, I couldn't say," Miss Marple replied. "An old locket, perhaps, a letter. Something that would prove the story true. Something someone else might not want discovered." She left the words hanging between them. "Well, I mustn't keep you. I just thought that, as a writer, you might find the story interesting." She turned to leave, then paused, as if haunted by a thought. "Oh, and Mr. Blake? The police found a button near the crime scene, and a very distinctive shoe print. It seems the killer is a man. You see, they're already looking for new evidence. The truth always comes out, doesn't it?" She didn't look back as she walked away. She had sown 2 seeds. One was a story for the writer, a captivating historical mystery that might entice him to dig deeper, to ask questions no one else wanted to ask. The other was a warning to the killer, a message indicating that the police weren't as convinced as they seemed of Elodie's guilt. She hoped that one of them would quickly bear fruit. She didn't have to wait long. The next afternoon, while she was pruning her roses, she saw Philip Blake walking purposefully away from the path towards the village. He was carrying a notebook and wore a determined, questioning expression. He was going, she was sure, to old Mr. Sutcliffe's house. Good. Let him shake things up. But it was the second reaction that confirmed her suspicions. Later that evening, at nightfall, Lucy entered the living room to draw the curtains. "A gentleman is asking to see you, Miss Marple," she said, looking slightly flustered. "A Mr. Sterling. He says it's about the Hartley case." Sterling. The name meant nothing to her. Let him in, Lucy. The man who entered was well into his 60s, tall and impeccably dressed in a dark suit. He had a thin, intelligent face, a piercing gaze, and an expression of quiet authority. He carried a hat in his hand and a leather briefcase. "Miss Marple, thank you for seeing me without an appointment. My name is Charles Sterling. I am the solicitor for the Hartley estate." Ah, the law had arrived, but not the police. It was a family matter. "Please sit down, Mr. Sterling," said Miss Marple, indicating a chair. "How can I help you?" "An interest in this matter. I'm interested in most things that happen in my village, Mr. Sterling," she replied. "It's a small community. We look out for each other. Absolutely." He clasped his fingers together. "I understand you expressed doubts about Mrs. Hartley's guilt to the police." "I did it," Miss Marple said simply. "May I ask why?" She considered him for a moment. He was there for a reason. He represented the interests of the Hartley family, which was presumably Arthur's. But did they agree to uncover the truth, or to bury it? "Because the evidence doesn't add up," she said calmly. "The weapon was too heavy. The motive was too superficial. And Mr. Hartley's behaviour regarding the door in the days leading up to his death was inconsistent. He was protecting something, Mr. Sterling, and I believe he was killed for that." The lawyer's face was impassive, but his gaze was attentive. "What do you think he was protecting?" "I believe he had discovered something buried near that gate, something connected to an old scandal involving the former owners of the house, the Farrows." Then there was a glint in her eyes, a slight twitching of the muscles around her mouth. It vanished in an instant, but Miss Marple saw it. He knew. "A fascinating theory," he said in a neutral tone. "But I can assure you that the Hartley family has no knowledge of this kind. Arthur was a pragmatic man. He cared about the present, not the past." "Then why was he so obsessed with a rotten door?" asked Miss Marple gently. Sterling shifted in his seat, a sign of unease. "I couldn't say. A whim, perhaps. But I urge you to be cautious, Miss Marple. Unfounded speculation can be deeply damaging. The family is in mourning. They wish this matter to be resolved quickly and discreetly. I'm sure you understand. It wasn't a request. It was a warning, delivered with polite and professional courtesy. It's stop digging. I understand that a woman's life is at stake, Mr. Sterling," Miss Marple replied coldly. "I named aunt Edith study took too, and I have always found that discretion is rarely the truth." He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw in his eyes a new respect, tinged with mistrust. He picked up his briefcase and stood up. "Thank you for your time, Miss Marple. I hope, for everyone's sake, that the police's conclusions are correct." After he left, Miss Marple remained motionless. Charles Sterling hadn't come to gather information. He'd come to put an end to it. He knew the past. He knew it was a threat, and his mission was to protect the Hartley family. A family that seemed to include someone among its members who had a great deal to lose. The killer wasn't a ghost. He was a man in a business suit, a man with a reputation to protect, a legacy to secure. And he was nervous. Miss Marple's gentle questions were getting closer to the truth. Chapter 10. The visit from the solicitor, Charles Sterling, left a chill in Miss Marple's drawing-room that not even a blazing fire could dispel. His polite warning had been crystal clear. Cease your interference. But for Miss Marple, this was not an obstacle. It was confirmation. She was on the right track, and the fox was on edge. She needed to understand the connection between the Hartley family and the long-dead Lucinda Farrow. The answer, she was certain, lay not in public records, but in the family's private and protected world. and there was one person who might hold a piece of the puzzle, if only she could gain her trust. Elodie Hartley herself. A visit to the county jail was no small matter for a woman of her age and station, but Miss Marple possessed a quiet determination capable of moving mountains, or at least persuading a reluctant vicar to provide the necessary references and escort. Reverend Clement, though bewildered by her request, was too kind to refuse. The prison was a dark Victorian building of grey stone that seemed to absorb the daylight. Inside, the air smelled of disinfectant and despair. They were led into a small cold visiting room with a battered wooden table bolted to the floor. When Elodie Hartley was brought in, Miss Marple's heart sank. The woman was paler than ever, her eyes hollow with fear and exhaustion. She wore a drab institutional-style dress that made her look smaller, more fragile. But when she caught sight of Miss Marple, a faint spark of surprise and perhaps hope lit up her face. "Miss Marple, what are you doing here? I came to see how you are, my dear," said Miss Marple softly, as the vicar offered her a few embarrassed words of comfort before tactfully withdrawing to give them some privacy. "What do you think?" Elodie's voice was neutral, devoid of emotion. "They think I killed my husband." "I know what they're thinking," said Miss Marple, leaning slightly forward. "De pauvre." "But I don't believe it." Tears welled up in Elodie's eyes, the first real sign of emotion since her arrest. "You don't know, but everyone knows. The evidence." "You can tell many stories with evidence," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "I need your help to find the real one. I must question you about the door." A shadow passed over Elodie's face. "It's the shaant. That stupid gate. It's what caused all this. Why did you want it to disappear so badly? It was ugly. It was rotten. It was the symbol of everything old, dilapidated and stubborn about this place. Arthur's stubbornness more than anything." She wrung her hands on the table. "I wanted something new, fresh. I wanted to create a beautiful garden, a new beginning. He didn't want that. He said it had to stay. Then, suddenly last week, he changed his mind. He said I could have it taken down. I thought he was finally listening to me." She let out a bitter, stifled laugh. "I should have known. Who suggested you remove the door?" asked Miss Marple. "Was that your only idea?" Elodie frowned, lost in thought. I always hated it, but it was Philip who told me to insist. He said Arthur was being unreasonable, that it was my house too. He even found me a landscaping company. He said it was time Arthur stopped living in the past. Philip Blake, the helpful friend. Miss Marple kept this in reserve. And on the night of the murder, Miss Marple insisted, her voice barely a whisper. "You told the vicar that you saw the silhouette of the gate in the mist. Are you sure of that?" Elodie's gaze drifted, clouded by memory. "Sure, I think. It was blurry, but I was so used to seeing him there. He was like a ghost. I blinked and he was gone." She shuddered. "But the police said that was impossible. They said it was my imagination." "Perhaps that's true," said Miss Marple soothingly. "Now, one more thing, my dear. The powder compact." Elodie was speechless. "Compact? A small silver makeup bag. It's supposedly old, maybe with an initial on it." Understanding dawned, followed by confusion. "She did. Oh, that. Arthur found it weeks ago, searching at the base of the gatepost. It was strange, discreet. He asked me if I'd ever seen it before. No, it was tarnished and broken. I thought it was just junk. Why, what did he do with it?" "He put it in his office, in a small locked drawer. He said it was an insurance policy." She shook her head, perplexed. I didn't understand what he meant. Insurance. The word hung in the cold air. Arthur Hartley, the businessman, had found a way to exert pressure and had locked it away. He hadn't protected the door out of sentimentality. He had protected the secret it contained, a secret he could use. Miss Marple reached across the table and placed her hand on Elodie's cold beer. "Thank you, my dear. It's very helpful. You mustn't lose hope." Elodie's grip tightened desperately. "But what can I do? Nobody listens to me. I'm listening," Miss Marple said firmly. "And sometimes that's enough." She left the prison with the vicar, her mind reeling. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with terrifying clarity. Arthur Hartley had found the pact. He had deduced its meaning. Perhaps through his own research. Perhaps because someone had warned him. He understood that it was proof of an old scandal that could harm someone, and he had decided to use it. He had locked it away as insurance and stood guard at the door, the source of his newfound power. But someone had discovered his knowledge. Someone had figured out the existence of the pact and where it was probably hidden. This person must have realized it. Unearthing the door in front of Hartley was out of the question. So they devised a plan. They manipulated Elodie into campaigning for the door's removal, thus providing perfect cover. Once the door was torn down and the earth turned over, they dug under cover of darkness. But Arthur Hartley, suspicious, had been watching them. He had surprised them. There had been a confrontation, and he had been killed. The killer then retrieved the powder compact from the desk. The locked drawer posed no obstacle for a desperate person, and presumably destroyed it. They had what they came for. They thought they were safe, but they were wrong, for Miss Marple had found her twin, buried deeper than the killer had dug, and she knew the truth. The murderer's identity was now clear. It was someone who knew the pharaoh's history, someone who stood to lose a great deal if that history were revealed, someone who had access to the house and knew Arthur Hartley's habits, someone who had encouraged the removal of the gate, someone who could move freely between the world of the old priory and that of London's solicitors. As the vicar's car bumped up the road to Marlicombe, Miss Marple gazed at the peaceful countryside. The killer had thought he had buried the past for good, but he had underestimated the tenacity of the present. He hadn't reckoned with a sharp, aged eye, capable of discerning patterns that others missed. The final act was yet to come, but first she had to force the killer's hand. She had to make him believe that his secret was still at risk of being discovered. She had to set a trap for him. Not with steel, but with words, and she knew exactly how to do it.